Blossoms on cherry tree, left to wind, will fall, my way, not looking back. Those words were written in the spring of 1945 by a young man from Hiroshima. His name was Tsutomu Fujimura. He was a flight petty officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He wrote them the night before he climbed into a plane loaded with 800 kilograms of explosives and flew it into an American warship. He left no long letter, only a short opening which said, "I do not have a last letter. I do not have a will. I believe in the permanence of Shinshu. I will push forward as my duty. I live for an eternal cause." And then the 31-syllable tanka poem that I opened with, a form that Japanese poets had used to describe love and loss and the passage of seasons for over 1,000 years. He was only 19 years old. Now, to the Western observer, this story seems like obvious propaganda, fanaticism, a death cult manufactured by a military state to throw its young men against a superior enemy. And there is some truth in that reading. The machinery of war did use these men. It in fact consumed them whole. But that reading doesn't explain the cherry blossom poem. It doesn't explain the letters home, which are tender, private, and absolutely human, in which these young men wept over their mothers and prayed for their unborn children and asked forgiveness for the trouble they were causing. It doesn't explain why, 25 years after the war had ended, one of Japan's greatest novelists, a man who had survived, who was celebrated across the world, who had been nominated 5 times for the Nobel Prize, stood on a military balcony in Tokyo, gave a speech that no one listened to, and then went inside and disemboweled himself. His name was Yukio Mishima. He was 45 years old, and he had been planning this death for a large part of his life. This is the story of a civilization's relationship with death. Not death as tragedy, not death as defeat, but death as the highest possible expression of meaning. Death as beauty. To understand what happened in those final years of the Second World War, to understand Mishima, you have to go back. Far back. To a set of ideas so deeply woven into Japanese culture that they were not experienced as some sort of ideology. They were experienced as reality. The first idea is this, that death is not the opposite of life. It is merely the completion of it. In the warrior tradition of Japan, specifically the code known as Bushido, or the way of the warrior, this was not some poetic sentiment. It was practical instruction. The 18th century samurai manual, Hagakure, compiled by a retainer named Yamamoto Tsunetomo, has a startling introduction. The way of the samurai is found in death. It continues, a warrior must, every morning of his life, prepare himself mentally to die that day. He must practice dying, contemplate dying, make himself at home with dying, not because life is worthless, but because only a man who has genuinely relinquished his life is truly free. Only he can act without hesitation, without self-preservation clouding his judgment, without fear distorting his loyalty. The samurai did not fear a beautiful death. They regarded it as preferable to a dishonorable life, and beautiful in this context was not merely aesthetic. It was moral. A death was beautiful if it was purposeful, voluntary, and witnessed. If it made a statement that could not be unmade. This is not entirely foreign to the Western tradition. Something that came to my mind personally was the Christian remembrance of death, simply put as memento mori in the Catholic tradition, or literally remember your death. Another thing that came to mind was this clip of an Orthodox monk accentuating this same point.
Morte, 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 morte.
To further this point, in the history of the Western canon, the Greeks understood this principle surrounding death as well. Socrates chose the hemlock over exile. The Spartans at Thermopylae understood it. 300 men holding a pass not because they thought they would survive, but because the manner of their dying would help forge an identity for their people. The Christian martyrs understood it as well. To die for something is one of the oldest human gestures toward transcendence. But in Japan, this idea was given a very specific theological home. Shinto, Japan's indigenous spiritual tradition, is not a religion of sin and redemption in the Christian sense. It is a religion of purity and pollution, of presence and harmony. The world is alive with kami, sacred presences, spirits, divine energies that inhabit everything from great mountains to household rice pots. And at the center of Shinto, by the late 19th and early 20th century, stood the emperor. The emperor of Japan was not merely a political figure, and not merely a symbolic one. He was, in the official theology of the Meiji and Showa periods, an Arahitogami, a divine being in human form, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, the ancestor of the Japanese people and the living link between heaven and earth. This was not cynical propaganda invented from scratch, though it was certainly used as propaganda at times. It was a genuine elaboration of ancient religious ideas. The emperor served as a sacred link between the heavens and earth. What follows from this theology is crucial. To die for the emperor was not merely to die for some political cause in the Western sense. It was to die for the divine. It was a religious act. The warrior who gave his life in the emperor's service was not destroyed by death. He was translated by it, gathered into the sacred community of the heroic dead, enshrined at Yasukuni Jinja in Tokyo, where the spirits of fallen soldiers were venerated as kami themselves. Death, in this framework, was not a wall. It was a door. And the cherry blossom, sakura, was the symbol the culture chose to represent this truth. The cherry blossom blooms with violent intensity for just a few days, and then it falls. It does not linger. It does not decay gradually on the branch. It falls at the height of its beauty. To fall like a cherry blossom at the moment of fullest bloom, before any corruption, is an act of luminous release. This was the ideal death. This is what the culture called beautiful. Midori Yamanouchi, who grew up in Japan during the war and is now a college professor at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania, wrote Listen to the Voices from the Sea, a book about the kamikaze. In a CBS News article, she is quoted as saying that she didn't see the kamikaze as entirely uniquely Japanese, emphasizing that the defense line was completely gone at the end of the war, and that many would see the brave actions of the kamikaze as a last stand of sorts to protect their loved ones at home. In commentary on the final letter of a kamikaze pilot who made an allusion to the cherry blossoms, she stated, "That is from the old samurai's code, to die beautifully. The cherry blossom falls beautifully, doesn't it? It doesn't cling on to it." Again, by 1944, Japan was losing the war. The industrial might of the United States had ground down the Imperial Navy and Air Force. Experienced pilots were dead. Planes were few. The Allied forces were island hopping toward the Japanese home islands, and no conventional military strategy seemed capable of stopping them. It was in this context that Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro proposed the formation of the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack units. In English, we call them the kamikaze. Kamikaze means divine wind. It is a reference to the typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281, saving Japan from conquest. The name was chosen deliberately. These pilots were not merely weapons. They were, in the theology of the moment, an act of divine intervention. Young men who had become the wind itself, the sacred force that protected Japan. The first kamikaze attacks were launched in October 1944 in the Philippines. Over the remaining months of the war, nearly 4,000 men would die this way. And that 4,000 counts the kamikaze pilots themselves. It doesn't include the thousands of Allied personnel who died as a result of their attacks. The usual estimate of Allied personnel that died is around 7,000. And we actually know quite a bit about these kamikaze pilots because they wrote letters. In the days and hours before their flights, these young men, many of them university students, intellectuals, poets, athletes, wrote to their parents, their wives, their children, their younger brothers and sisters. Some letters were formal and stoic, written in the high style of Bushido, full of phrases about duty and the emperor. Others were raw, heartbroken, intimate in a way that makes them almost unbearable to read. They are among the most remarkable documents of the Second World War. Ensign Ichizo Hayashi was 23 years old, a student of economics at Kyoto Imperial University. He was also a Christian. He wrote his final letter to his mother on March 31st, 1945, at Gensan Air Base in Korea, and then continued adding to it over the following days until the morning of his flight. The letter opens with a poem, the death poem of Yoshida Shoin, a 19th century loyalist who had gone to his execution quoting Mencius. Hayashi understood what tradition he was entering. And then he wrote to his mother in plain language, "I am happy to have been selected as a Special Attack Corps member and to depart for the front, but I am moved to tears when I think of you." He was embarrassed by his own tears. He was afraid of dying, and he was also afraid that his fear would somehow dishonor the sacrifice. He wrote, "I still wanted to be taken care of by you. There is nothing that made me happier than letters." And then he reaches for his faith. He writes that he's been reading the Bible every day. He plans to carry a Bible and a hymnal on his plane when he makes his crash attack. He quotes the Apostle Paul, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And he means it. He is not using scripture as some sort of decoration. He is genuinely trying to make theological sense of what he's about to do. To locate his death within a framework of meaning larger than the emperor, larger than Japan, and larger than the war. He writes, "I will be singing a hymn when I crash into an enemy ship." At Kanoya Air Base, a few days later, he wrote a final addition to the letter. He had been lying in a field, looking at cherry blossoms falling in a southern breeze, thinking of home. He wrote, "Tomorrow I'll make a sure-hit attack on a group of enemy aircraft carriers. The anniversary of my death perhaps will be April 10th. On April 12th, 1945, Ichizo Hayashi took off from Kanoya Air Base. He was never heard from again. Second Lieutenant Toshio Kuramoto was 30 years old, older than most of the pilots, a commercial college graduate, and a man who had fought as an infantryman before volunteering for the Air Force. He had been married for less than 3 months when he died. His wife, Kimiko, was pregnant. He never met his daughter. He wrote his farewell letters in the pre-dawn hours of May 4th, 1945, starting at 5:05 in the morning and finishing by 5:28, 23 minutes, in which he wrote to his mother, his wife, his older sister, his unborn child, his father-in-law, whom he had never met because the war had separated them, his mother-in-law, and 2 younger siblings. To his mother, "I warmly thank you for your great kindness for 30 years. Please forgive me for going without showing filial piety to you." To his wife, "Please forgive me for the time of departure. Only because I loved you, my heart was filled with a desire to not cause you sadness for a while. I absolutely was not lying." And then on a separate page, he named his unborn child. He wrote out 2 versions, one for a boy and one for a girl. The name for a girl, Ryoko. He wrote, "Written by Father Toshio." His daughter Ryoko was born in January 1946, 5 months after the war had ended. She never knew him. First Lieutenant Hajime Fuji had requested twice to join the Special Attack Forces. Both times the army refused. He was too valuable as an instructor, and he had a young wife and 2 daughters. So his wife, Fukuko, decided for him. On December 14th, 1944, she dressed their daughters in their finest kimonos. 3-year-old Kazuko and 1-year-old Chieko walked to the Arakawa River near the airbase and jumped in with them. She tied her eldest daughter's hand to her own wrist with a rope and carried the youngest on her back. The next morning, their 3 bodies were found on the riverbank. She had left a letter. "Since you probably would be worried about us and not be able to freely carry out your duties because we are here, we go ahead before you and will wait for you. Please fight without reserve." Fuji was summoned to identify the bodies. He crouched over them in the snow and brushed the sand from their white faces. He said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I am always telling my students to commit themselves totally, to be ready to die, but I myself cannot devote myself this far." That night, he wrote a letter to his 3-year-old daughter. "Your life disappeared as dew on Arakawa River's bank," he wrote. "It is painfully sad that together with your mother you sacrificed yourself ahead of your father. Daddy will perform a great feat on the battlefield and bring it as a present for you. Both you and Chieko, please wait for me until then." He then wrote a 3rd petition to join the Special Attack Force, this time in his own blood. The army accepted. On May 28, 1945, Fuji's squadron flew toward Okinawa. His aircraft crashed into the destroyer USS Drexler. The ship sank in less than a minute. 158 American sailors died. Fuji was going to meet Fukuko and Kazuko and Chieko. He'd been waiting for months to keep his promise. To read these letters as pure products of propaganda, as the output of brainwashed robots, is to refuse to take them seriously as human beings. They were philosophers, poets, athletes, fathers, sons, husbands. There's many stories you can read. This was just a sampling of a few interesting ones from kamikazeimages.net. So, again, all of these men were thinking about what they were doing. Something was happening in these men that goes deeper than mere state ideology. They were enacting something ancient, something about the relationship between the individual and death, between sacrifice and meaning, between the willingness to die and the act of truly living. That something is exactly what Yukio Mishima spent his entire life trying to understand. On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. The emperor addressed the nation by radio for the first time in history. Most Japanese had never heard his voice. He announced the end of the war in the formal court language of ancient Japan, so elevated and archaic that many listeners could not fully understand him. But they understood this. It was over. American forces occupied Japan. General Douglas MacArthur took up residence in Tokyo. Within months, the old order was systematically dismantled. A new constitution was written, drafted largely by American staff officers in a matter of days. They stripped the emperor of all political power, renounced war as an instrument of national policy, and established Western-style liberal democracy. And then came what Mishima and many others experienced as the deepest wound of all. On January 1st, 1946, Emperor Hirohito issued an imperial rescript that came to be known as the Ningen Sengen, or the Declaration of Humanity. In it, the emperor formally denied that he was a god. He stated that the relationship between emperor and people was not based on the quote-unquote false conception of divinity, but on mutual trust and affection. In one statement, one of the main theological foundations of the entire sacrificial tradition was dissolved. 4,000 men had thrown themselves into the enemy in the most spectacular way, in part due to this tradition, and now the emperor had rejected it. The young men who had died in the special attack forces had not merely lost the war. They had been, in some sense, betrayed by the very theology that had claimed them. The emperor for whom they had burned in the sky for now said that he was never that important. Their sacrifice, their beauty, their cherry blossom deaths, all of it now floated free of any transcendent meaning, like a kite whose string had been cut. Japan rebuilt itself, with stunning speed and discipline, became an economic powerhouse. The post-war decades brought prosperity, modernization, consumer goods, Western music, Western clothes, Western values. The old codes faded. The warrior tradition became embarrassing, in association with the war, with the atrocities held against them. But for some Japanese, this transformation felt less like liberation than like amputation. Something essential had been cut away. The form of Japan remained, the language, the faces, the rice fields, and the shrines, but the soul of it, the thing that had given it its distinctive shape and depth and willingness to die, had been replaced with something shallow, something American, something Western, something that, in Mishima's view, was spiritually empty at its core. Mishima was a boy of 20 when the war ended. He had been expecting to die. He had spent the final years of the war in a state of heightened, almost ecstatic preparation, writing, reading, and dreaming of the moment when he too would be called. The call never came. He was rejected from military service on medical grounds, a mistaken diagnosis of tuberculosis. He survived, and survival for Mishima was its own kind of problem. Kimitake Hiraoka was born in Tokyo in 1925, the son of a mid-level government official. He was a sickly, bookish child, raised largely by his grandmother in a darkened room, kept away from the sun and from other boys, fed on books and solitude and a grandmother's fierce, possessive love. He would later take the pen name Yukio Mishima. It was a name chosen partly for its concealment, a way of hiding his literary life from a disapproving father, and partly for its resonances. Mishima contains the characters for beauty and island. 3 islands of beauty. He was, from the very beginning, constructing himself as an aesthetic object. As mentioned earlier, near the end of the war, in February 1945, the call for him to serve his country came. Mishima was ordered to report for a physical examination, the final step before conscription. By this point in the war, the standards for who counted as fit to fight had collapsed, along with everything else. Japan was scraping together everybody it could find. The unit he was bound for was, by several accounts, slated for deployment to the Philippines, where Japanese infantry were being annihilated in suicidal last stands. To be sent there in early 1945 was, in practical terms, close to a death sentence. The kind of posting that ended not in retreat, but in a final, hopeless banzai charge against an overwhelming American force. At the examination, an army doctor, misreading the symptoms of a bad cold as the early signs of tuberculosis, pronounced him unfit for service. Mishima was sent home the same day. He would spend the rest of his life unable to decide what that moment meant. On one level, he had simply been the passive object of a doctor's mistake. He bore no responsibility for it. But Mishima was constitutionally incapable of leaving it at that. He had, by his own unsparing account, felt something close to relief in the moment of the rejection. And relief, to a mind that had become obsessed with the idea of a beautiful, voluntary death, was unforgivable. He came to suspect that some part of him had wanted to be sent home, that his body, frail and sickly since childhood, had betrayed him at the exact moment when it was asked to prove itself. He had began writing as a child with a facility so extraordinary that his teachers were bewildered by it. By his mid-20s, he was already famous in Japan. His novel Confessions of a Mask from 1949 was a sensation, a barely fictional account of a young man who discovers, through his erotic response to paintings of Saint Sebastian, that he is drawn to male beauty and to the beauty of death, and who constructs an elaborate false persona to survive in a world that cannot accommodate what he truly is. The mask was Mishima's central metaphor. All his life, he would write about the gap between surface and interior, between the constructed self and the authentic one, between life as it is lived and life as it might be perfected through death. He wrote 50 novels, 33 plays, countless essays. He directed films, performed in them, sang opera, studied kendo, which is Japanese swordsmanship, practiced karate, posed for photographs in the guise of a dying Saint Sebastian with arrows in his body. He cultivated his physical form with obsessive intensity, spending years transforming himself from the pale, slight, bookish child he had been into a man of visible, sculptured muscle. He wrote about this transformation at length in his book, Sun and Steel, one of the most unusual texts in modern literature. Quoting from my Substack article titled The Push Button Mind. In Sun and Steel, Mishima argues that modern life traps people in abstract words and theories while separating them from physical realities. He believed that when a society loses hardship and forgets the importance of personal action, it produces passive citizens who are easily managed. It creates men of words who talk endlessly yet take no action. Think of the endless parliamentary games played in our modern democracies. Yukio Mishima, in recalling his own experience, states, "Nor had I ever experienced an intellectual adventure, the selfless heat, the hot darkness of physical action." This confession reveals more than just a personal experience. It exposes a wider societal sickness. Mishima contrasts intellectual adventure with the heat of action. This suggests that intellectual pursuits are somewhere out there, with many becoming so enamored in them that they become detached from real risk or consequence. He visited the museum at Etsujima, the old naval base, where the final letters of the Kamikaze pilots are preserved under glass. He stood before those cases and read those letters, and he understood something. He wrote about it in Sun and Steel, describing one letter in particular. A letter from a young man written in pencil, hurriedly, breaking off in mid-sentence. "At the moment, I am full of life, my whole body overflowing with youth and strength. It seems impossible that I shall be dead in 3 hours' time. And yet..." Mishima understood this. The sentence that could not be finished. The gap between the overflowing body and the approaching death. That was the only truth that words could not contain. This is what Mishima wanted. Not to die as Kimitake Hirayuka, the man with a father who disapproved of him and a body that had failed him, but to die as a figure, as a statement about what Japan had forgotten, as a kind of human poem about the beauty it had thrown away. In 1960, he published a short story called Patriotism. The story is set on the night of February 28th, 1936, the final night of what Japanese history calls the February 26th incident, an attempted coup by young ultranationalist army officers. The story follows a young lieutenant, Shinji Takayama, whose closest friends are among the mutineers. Unable to attack his friends on orders from the emperor, and unable to join the mutiny without betraying his emperor, he sees only one way out. He performs ritual suicide, seppuku, while his young wife Reiko watches, and then she kills herself with a dagger. The seppuku scene goes on for pages. The cutting of the abdomen, the lateral movement of the blade, the blood, the pain, the moaning, the entrails, described in language that is simultaneously agonizingly physical and strangely beautiful. It reads as what Mishima intended, as a kind of liturgy, a ceremony. He later adapted patriotism into a short film, which he directed and starred in himself. He played the lieutenant. He wore the uniform. He performed the mock seppuku with the rubber sword, his face contorted in what looked like genuine ecstasy. He was rehearsing. By the late 1960s, Mishima had become convinced that words alone were not enough. He had spent his life making art, extraordinary art, art of international recognition and depth. And he decided that art, by its very nature, was a failure. Not as art specifically, art as such. Because art preserves, it takes the moment of beauty and locks it in amber, keeps it alive past its time. But the beauty he was after was beauty that does not survive, the beauty of the cherry blossom precisely because it falls. He began assembling a small private army. The Tadanokai, the Shield Society, was founded by Mishima in 1968. It was a small paramilitary organization composed mostly of young students who admired his work and shared his nationalist convictions. They trained with the Japanese self-defense forces, practiced swordsmanship, wore uniforms that Mishima designed himself. Aesthetically considered, of course, because everything Mishima did was aesthetically considered. Their stated purpose was to serve as a vanguard force that would hold back a communist revolution long enough for the self-defense forces to respond. But this stated purpose was, in a sense, theater. What the Shield Society really was, what Mishima was really doing, was constructing the group that Sun and Steel had told him he needed. He had written, "Only through the group, I realized, through sharing the suffering of the group, could the body reach that height of existence that the individual alone could never attain." The group, properly constituted, was not merely an organization. It was a tragic community, a band of warriors oriented toward death, whose shared suffering would lift them all above the merely personal. He had also, by this point, written his final masterwork, the 4-novel sequence, The Sea of Fertility, completed on the morning of his death. Its themes are karma, reincarnation, the persistent disappointment of every ideal when it finally incarnates in the imperfect world of bodies and time, and the necessity of reaching beyond that imperfection towards something purer, something transcendent. He knew what he was going to do. He had been planning it for years. He told almost no one. The morning of November 25th, 1970, was cold and clear in Tokyo. Mishima rose before dawn, as was his habit, and finished the final pages of The Sea of Fertility. He sent the manuscript to his publisher. He was precise about the timing. The last page of the novel was to arrive at the publisher's office the same morning he died. He met with 4 members of the Shield Society, who were all in on the plan. Together they drove to the headquarters of the Eastern Command of the Japan Self-Defense Forces at Ichigaya in central Tokyo. They had a scheduled appointment with the commandant, General Kenetoshi Mashita. Mishima had been using his connections with the military establishment. He was a known figure, a celebrated novelist, someone who had been allowed unusual access to the self-defense forces to arrange this meeting. Once inside Mashita's office, Mishima and his followers took the general hostage. They barricaded the door with furniture. Mishima issued a written demand that the soldiers of the Eastern Command be assembled on the parade ground below so that he could address them. The military complied, not from agreement, but because they were trying to negotiate the release of the general. About 1,000 soldiers gathered in the courtyard. At 12 noon, Mishima stepped onto the balcony. He wore the Shield Society uniform. He had rehearsed this speech. He had written it. He had been writing toward it, in a sense, for his entire life. He began to speak. He told the soldiers that Japan had prostituted itself, that the self-defense forces existed in a constitutional trap, unable to be a real army, unable to defend Japan's true soil, because the post-war constitution written by the American occupiers forbade it. He called on them to rise, to demand a revision of the constitution, to restore Japan's right to a genuine military, a genuine national spirit, and a genuine tradition. The soldiers below heckled him. They shouted. Helicopters circled overhead. The press had arrived. The noise was so great that Mishima's words were almost inaudible. He stood at the balcony for 7 minutes, shouting into the chaos, and then he stopped. He had known this would happen. He had known no one would listen. He had known, on some level, that the coup was not really a coup. It was a performance, and its final act had always been what came next. He went back inside. He removed his jacket and military tunic. He knelt on the floor of the commandant's office, facing north. He took the Seki no Magoroku blade in both hands. He thrust it into the left side of his abdomen. He drew it across. Morita, his most devoted follower, was supposed to serve as his kashakunin, the second who would complete the act with a single beheading stroke, sparing the dying man prolonged agony. But Morita's hands were shaking. It took 3 strokes. A third man, Koga, completed the beheading with 1 clean blow. Morita then performed his own seppuku. He too was beheaded by Koga. The 3 surviving Shield Society members surrendered to the police. Mishima was 45 years old. In his farewell poem, written beforehand, he'd asked, "Is man's life so small a thing, and so much smaller, hope?" He had been asking that question since he was a boy, reading in the dark by his grandmother's side, since he stood in a post-war street and felt the emptiness where Divine Emperor had been, since he read the Kamikaze letters under their glass in the Etajima Museum and understood that those young men, in the moment of their death, had achieved something that no amount of writing could ever achieve. He had answered his own question with his body. The cherry blossom falls. Mishima's death shocked Japan. It shocked the world. The Nobel Prize Committee, many believed, had been about to give him the award. He was, at 45, in the middle of what might have been the greatest creative period of his life. The Sea of Fertility is, by many accounts, his finest achievement. The initial reaction in Japan was largely embarrassed dismissal, a tragic eccentric, a genius who had lost his mind, a man seduced by his own aesthetics into an act of theatrical self-destruction. The West mostly agreed. The coup had failed. The speech had been shouted down. The soldiers he had appealed to had laughed and jeered. The whole thing seemed, on the surface, like a farce, a performance that no one had asked for, serving no political purpose, changing nothing. And now for some of my own personal opinion. I don't think he was wrong about what he had diagnosed. He was wrong perhaps about the prescription. I think he was certainly wrong about what the Japanese military or what the Japanese people could be made to do in 1970. And I think he realized that. He was describing a civilization that had lost its capacity to believe in anything worth dying for, a modernity that had replaced depth with comfort, sacrifice with consumption, tragedy with entertainment, a world in which the question, "What are you willing to die for?" had become not only unanswerable, but unaskable, embarrassing, primitive, the kind of thing fanatics ask. And this is not only a Japanese problem. This is the condition of the modern West as well. The kamikaze pilots were not monsters. They were young men who had been given, by their culture, their theology, their emperor, a framework in which death could be meaningful, in which the manner of dying was not an accident but an act, a thing that could be done well or badly, a thing that could be beautiful. Many of them were conflicted, frightened, heartbroken, but they were also, in their own understanding, doing something, making a statement that could not be unmade, becoming, for a moment, the cherry blossom in full bloom at the moment of its fall. Mishima's whole life was an attempt to recover that framework, or rather, to find its truth beneath the specific and terrible circumstances in which those men had lived it. To separate it from the war, from the nationalism, from the state machinery that had exploited it. To ask, is there something here that is simply human? A genuine truth about the relationship between beauty and death, between sacrifice and meaning, between the willingness to lose everything and the capacity to be, for one moment, fully alive. In Sun and Steel, he wrote that he had discovered in the letters of the kamikaze pilots 2 kinds of language that men use when they know the end is near. One kind falters, breaks off mid-sentence, overwhelmed by the sheer reality of dying. The other rises to impersonal heights, choosing ancient and impersonal words, not out of falseness, but out of a genuine desire to become those words, to sacrifice the individual I on the altar of something larger. He wanted to be both. He wanted his death to be true enough to falter and beautiful enough to become a figure. Whether he succeeded is a question that is still being debated. What is not debatable is this. He meant it. Unlike so many write about death and sacrifice and the beauty of giving everything, Mishima meant it. He really went through with it all. He'd been preparing his whole life. He trained his body for it. He wrote novels that circled around it, came closer and closer to the center like a man walking a labyrinth. He founded an organization for it. He chose a 16th century blade for it. And on a cold morning in November 1970, when he finished the last page of his last novel, he walked into the office in Ichigaya and did what he'd always said he would do. And another thing that I see personally in this is it's almost like making up for the fact that he wasn't in the war, you know? He had missed it. And that's why he felt so weird about it. He felt guilty about it, that he had not died then with all those men in the Philippines. And so this was almost his way of making up for it. And again, everything else I said, making the statement. And in the end, he fell like a cherry blossom. There is one more thing worth saying. The Japanese filmmaker Nagisa Oshima, himself a man of enormous artistic seriousness, said of Mishima's death that he should have lived, that he should have witnessed his own old age, his deterioration, his ugliness, for the sake of his art. I think this is a generous and humane view. It's probably right, in the sense that great art often requires a willingness to be diminished, to be mortal and awkward and alive past one's peak, and to keep making things go anyway. But Mishima had made his choice years before. He decided the art he wanted to make could only be made once, and could only be made with everything. He decided that a beautiful death, fully voluntary, fully conscious, at the moment of maximum creative power, this was the only form of completion available to him. Right or wrong, it was a decision of extraordinary seriousness. And the young man at Kanoya Air Base, lying in a field in the spring of 45, planning to sing a hymn as he died, that young man would have understood it completely. They were both, in their different ways, trying to answer the same question. How do you fall beautifully? Japan at its deepest, the Japan that wrote the tanka and built the tea ceremony, and trained for decades to achieve a single perfect sword stroke, has always believed that this question is not morbid. It is not nihilistic. It is, in fact, the most serious question a human being can ask. And this is because if you know how you are willing to die, you know how you are willing to live.